Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our series of field ecology hikes as part of our UB class. We finished up last week at Shale Creek with a focus on northern hardwood forests. Today we'd like to welcome you to Beaver Island State Park, and today's focus will be on field ornithology. So today we play with the birds. Before we do so, however, I wanted to go through our list of sightings from last week. So we'll do this at the beginning of each session to keep up with our sightings so that you can keep up with your journal. So I have my list here from last week, and we'll see how comprehensive your lists were. All right, here's what I have. And for those of you keeping track, I'm beginning with number 46 in our continuing listing of field sightings. And I begin with redwood. And you remember that was our tree from the Pan American Exposition. An odd place to find a redwood. Next, I have the American basswood, followed by black birch and pincushion moss. Then I have turkey tail fungus and another fungus called crowded parchment. That is followed by two ferns, the evergreen wood fern and the Christmas fern. Then the American chestnut, who had a very interesting story, I'm sure you remember. And then the big-tooth aspen, the cucumber tree, and then a few birds. We had the white-breasted nuthatch, the dark-eyed junco, the blue jay, and we finished up with partridge berry and the tufted titmouse, another interesting bird of the forest. So that's what I have thus far. So that takes us to about 62 in number. And please do keep up with your journals. And if you have any questions, you can address them with me at a later time. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to begin our session today with a little bit of a historic overview for you. When it comes to the field of ornithology, I want you to know that in years past, a birder, by definition, was one who killed birds for food or sport. That was the definition for a very long time, actually up until the 1940s. Back in the day, back in the 19th century, in the time when so much of the early ornithology work was done, people, in fact, were called shotgun ornithologists. And the notion was that they identified birds by having them in the hand. And the only way that you could have them in the hand is by shooting them. So ornithologists during the 19th century would take to the field with shotgun, and when they found an interesting bird, they'd pop them, and they would identify them in the hand in that way. Actually, they had a saying back then: what is hit is history, what is missed is mystery. So the only way to prove what you had was to have them right in your hand. So when we talk about the early ornithologists, I think there are three individuals in particular that I'd like you to be aware of. They, in so many ways, created the foundation of the field of ornithology, the study of birds. And we go back to the early 1800s, and we begin with an individual by the name of Alexander Wilson. He was actually a Scottish-American naturalist and ornithologist and artist. And he compiled a 9-volume set called American Ornithology. And he had well over 200 birds drawn and depicted. And it was through his early work that we really started to get some sense for what bird life was like in America. As a matter of fact, I mean, to this day you can appreciate his impact when you hear the names of Wilson's storm petrel, or Wilson's plover, or Wilson's warbler. There's actually even a whole genus of warblers named after him as well. And so, I mean, to this date, his impact is certainly felt throughout, just as he influenced the birders that came after him. Another individual that came after him was Thomas Nuttall. Thomas Nuttall was an English naturalist and botanist and ornithologist, and he too traveled the Americas in the early 1800s and was involved with very important publications, not only in the bird world, but in the plant world as well. So Thomas Nuttall, and his name also has come through with various bird species. We have Nuttall's woodpecker that lives out west. And in terms of the scientific names, Nuttall is there with the yellow-billed magpie, and is there with the common poor-will. And they take, you know, his name in their scientific name, just as his name is also attached to various plants, like the Pacific dogwood. Nuttall is connected to that. And also we have Nuttall's oak in the genus Quercus. And so these early naturalists and ornithologists remain with us through the names of so many, and in many cases individuals that they first identified through their work. So Wilson was considered the foremost birder, the most well-known birder of his time, until we reach a little later into the 19th century, and John James Audubon, who was influenced by Wilson, then became the foremost birder as we move through the century. And he produced his volume of American Birds, which he produced in the late 1820s, and he continued to produce work into the 1830s. And of course, Audubon's claim to fame was his work as an artist, for he was the first to really portray birds in a natural setting, exhibiting natural behaviors, and he really revolutionized the notion of artistry when it came to ornithology. But all of these individuals, Wilson and Nuttall and Audubon, they really laid the foundation, the groundwork for our understanding of birds in the Americas and in many cases beyond. Okay, right now I am looking at a pair of buffleheads. That's probably a new one for you. You know, our focus today is going to be on waterfowl because we are moving through wetlands and we're along the river, and we'll be talking about waterfowl in more detail as we move along. But a pair of buffleheads just landed, and these are representative of our sea ducks. We call them sea ducks. They are deep divers, and they feed on both plant but a considerable amount of animal material, mostly invertebrates. And the male is beautifully colored with a white crest on his head and a white and black body. And the female, duller, exhibiting sexual dimorphism. And the female is just about to come to the surface. She has a white circle on her head and just behind her eye a bit on her cheek, with a dark head and kind of a light grayish body. And the pair right now is diving deeply in this wetland, grabbing some lunch. I stand here by this little inland section of the wetland adjacent to the river. I wanted to finish up our little history lesson with you, if I may. We learned of the 19th century ornithologists. We learned about shotgun ornithology. So I guess the question is, what changed that? And what changed that is actually through the work of another individual. His name was Ludlow Griscom. Somebody very few people have actually heard of, but he had an enormous effect, an enormous impact on the study of birds. He was born in 1890 and lived and did much of his work in the New York City area, although of course he traveled through Central and South America and all over the world pursuing his interests in ornithology. But Ludlow Griscom was one who said to other ornithologists at the time, you don't have to kill the birds to identify them. There are other ways to be sure of who you're looking at. And he ushers in an age of the birder observing birds instead of shooting birds. And his notion was that, and it's quite logical, you can identify birds through various mechanisms, especially through their vocalizations. But along with their vocalizations, you also look at their color and color patterns. You look at their size. You look at their shape. You watch their behaviors. You appreciate their habitat and range. And along with their vocalizations, you put that information together, and there you have it, a positive ID. Now, of course, when a bird flies by, you may only see that bird for a couple of seconds, or you may only hear the bird for a moment, but these notions become a part of your birding consciousness, you see. And so the more you watch birds, the more you integrate those concepts. And so ultimately, he convinces ornithologists at that time to put down their shotguns and to work with these field markings, sights and sounds. And as he does so, he has individuals who study with him. And actually, one of the things he's most famous for is having another student by the name of Roger Torrey Peterson, who in 1934 published his Field Guide to the Birds, which ultimately put watching birds and identifying birds with a field guide and with these mechanisms on firm footing.